The elections that just passed, where voters in Colorado and Washington specifically passed ballot measures that allow people to use marijuana legally. Now, this is a little different than what's happened in the past, where medical marijuana in the past was what some states passed and made legal. And that was sort of the first breach in the wall of the federal drug policy that has marijuana diagnosed, is that a good word, Ben? Little pun there. Ben, of course, the most diagnosed person connected with this program, and you all know why. No medical marijuana for you, Ben. Absolutely not. I mean, you're already dysfunctional and disoriented. You don't need any help. In any case, the first crack in the wall of a federal drug policy that classifies marijuana as a Schedule I drug. For those of you who don't know what that is, Schedule I drugs are the worst drugs we have. Heroin, cocaine, which used to not be a Schedule I drug, was moved up into there once it became really popular and it was more people than just the Rolling Stones using it. LSD, the most dangerous drugs are Schedule I drugs. So when states start passing ballot measures that say that patients on their own with a doctor's signature, but apparently some doctors were, signing like some of these mortgage firms were signing robo-mortgages, but as soon as they said you could have a Schedule I drug, that was a chink in the armor right there. And now the chink has been made larger by Washington and Colorado's recent votes on this stuff, because this is not medical marijuana. This is, for personal recreational use type stuff. Now, I know people might want me to talk about that aspect of it, but we've done show after show after show. I don't know how many shows we've done on drugs, but my basic policy on drugs has always been that we ought to have some sort of logical system for determining when a drug should be legal or when it should be illegal. Because our current policy in this country since prohibition was lifted was that there should be no new drugs. Doesn't matter if it's good, doesn't matter if it's bad, we don't even weigh that fact. If there's some new intoxicant that appears on the street tomorrow, we will have some horror stories the next day, and boom, it will be made illegal as soon as possible. That's just been the policy. As a matter of fact, there were people in this country up until about, I don't know. Well, there still are. I mean, there's people that want alcohol illegal and always have been people that want alcohol illegal in this country. And we tried that, remember, for about a decade. I'll never forget the classic Dragnet with Joe Friday, Sergeant Joe Friday. Maybe some of you younger folks haven't seen this, but it's good for laughs now. And I remember they had an episode on marijuana, and you have Joe Friday, the old straight-laced cop, talking to the young marijuana user, and the young marijuana user, he says, "Hey, I'm a family man, and I hold down a job, and I have a good wife and child, and I'm doing just fine. And if I like to have a little pot at the end of the day, how is that any different from, the alcohol you like to drink at the end of your day?" And then Joe Friday, reads him the riot act by saying that that alcohol is dangerous and that lots of, societal problems are caused by it. And do they really need any more of that with some new drug? And of course, at the end of the episode, the guy whose life's going so well and he just uses a little pot at the end of the day, his child drowns in the bathtub because they were all so high on marijuana that they didn't pay any attention. But the point of the story was that even the argument made in that episode wasn't that, well, if marijuana is not very dangerous, maybe we should legalize it. It's that, hey, alcohol is perhaps a necessary evil that we can't do away with, and we've tried, and we would if we could, but we don't need any more alcohols, right? I think there ought to be some sort of organized test-based system, a criteria that you look at and you say, oh, some new drug's just been invented in some guy's bathtub or some chemist's lab, and here's what it does to people. Here's how, much the potential for abuse, stacks up against other drugs we know about, and, down the list. And at the very end, there's a score. And if you score above or below, whatever the criteria is, that score, you're either legal or illegal. Makes some rational sense. What doesn't make rational sense is the way we do things now. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug, ladies and gentlemen, and that's absurd. And no one in their right mind will get up there and defend why it's a Schedule I drug, which leads me to why I like this topic. I like the confrontation. I like that the federal government is being pushed up against a wall and forced to defend this stuff. Their policy is to simply repeat the mantra and not talk about the merits, pros, cons, or questions at all. When asked over and over about how they're going to respond to the will of the voters in Colorado and Washington, they'll say things like, well, federal policy still dictates this is a Schedule I drug and blah, 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 and the federal state primacy of federal laws and blah, blah. But nobody's addressing, hey, here's what voters want. Maybe federal drug policy is out of step. Maybe marijuana shouldn't be a Schedule I drug. They don't go into that at all. Now, I should point out that this isn't a question that is specific to the drug issue. This is symbolic of how the whole federal government has become when it comes to the question of hashing these issues out with the public, whatever it is. And I don't want you to think this is a Barack Obama thing. This is a trend that's been getting worse for years. Multi-presidents, just worse with every one. This idea that we kind of hold these, questions in secret meetings and whatnot, and we don't really talk about the deliberations, and we don't really explain things to the American people. We don't have a national debate, is what we used to call it, about these things. And the president doesn't hold some sort of, address to the nation where he explains his thinking about why marijuana should or shouldn't stay a Schedule I drug. We just dictate from on high. It's a Schedule I drug. The states don't have any right to preempt federal law. We're weighing our options right now. We're not going to tell you exactly what we're going to do about enforcing this. And then they just do stuff. And you'll remember President Obama, when he first got elected, said he was going to tell the Department of Justice to hold off on raiding medical marijuana facilities, and they did it anyway. And the president never had to then have the follow-up questions about, didn't you say you weren't going to do this? It just disappears into the explanation ether. I love that this is one of those issues that shoves the federal government up against the imaginary wall and says, gets in their face, and what are you going to do about it? And what are you going to say about it? And how are you going to justify what you are going to do about it? Explain yourself to the American people. If you think this stuff should stay illegal, and you think the voters of Washington and the voters of Colorado are wrong, tell us why. And don't just say because federal law trumps state law. Why is federal law the same way now when it comes to something like marijuana as it was in the first 2 decades of the 20th century? This goes back, folks, to stuff in the 1919s. I mean, this is post-World War I anti-drug hysteria that had a lot to do with things like racism. And we're sticking to it now. And we're not justifying why the, approach that was so irrational and racism-based and everything else from Henry Anslinger's time and before is still relevant now. We're just saying it's a Schedule I drug. You can't, federal law trumps state law, and we don't go into the actual merits of the case, I guess you could say. Now, you remember I was telling you about soul searching from the GOP and ways if the Republican Party wanted to change to become relevant again. And we talked about how parties sometimes make these big turns after losses. You see it with, you saw it when Reagan changed the Republicans into a more Goldwaterian type, Goldwaterian, what would you say, that type party in 1980, when the Democrats changed between 1968 and 1972. This happens all the time. What if the GOP seized upon this? Now, I realize, Ben, this is crazy because the guy who's holding up hearings is this Lamar Smith guy in Texas who's, crazy against this kind of stuff. But what if the GOP used this as a states' rights question? Because that's always been a big GOP thing, right? Let the states experiment. You can read your George Will conservative columnist. He'll talk about the states as laboratories and the founding fathers and all this. What if you turned around and said that the GOP maybe still thinks marijuana should be illegal, but they think that states' rights in this case should trump what the feds are telling the states to do, that the states need enough freedom to carve out a little bit of their own existence, right? And by the way, I should say, I do believe, I didn't save them, I don't have them in front of me, I do believe I've read a column here or a column there by conservatives who've hinted at this. Imagine what the GOP could do if all of a sudden they moved to, I don't think it's a left or right question, Ben. Let's just say the more green side of the question than President Obama himself. What if President Obama was more anti-marijuana legalization than the new and improved mellow GOP? The mellow elephant, Ben. We'll call him the mellow elephant. I know, that's silly, and people are going, Dan, you've lost your mind now. You must be smoking marijuana yourself. I'm not, but I'm thinking, folks, about younger generation Republicans. Remember, there was that great line. Who was it who said it? Was it Karl Rove, Ben, who said that the Republicans were not creating enough angry white males to sustain electoral victories into the future? In other words, their base is dying off. Well, there's a whole new group of conservatives out there coming up, and a whole new group of people who could be, if they agreed more with the policies. The policies look a little like old people policies in a lot of cases. If you want to reinvent yourself as a party, maybe finding some of these issues that can somehow be morphed, twisted, and molded into traditional conservative themes, like allowing the states to have more freedom to experiment, and use that. Make the marijuana issue simply an excuse to argue in a way that people might find resonating. You think that's some sort of pun, Ben? It's not. About a traditional conservative issue. You should be allowed in your state to have marijuana because that's what the people in your state voted for, and we conservatives feel that people should be allowed to have the latitude to make those decisions at the state level, right? We don't think the federal government should be coming in and telling you how to run things. Now, by the way, don't you remember the Ronald Reagan line about getting the government off your back? It was one of the most popular phrases he ever used when he ran both times for president. Let's get the federal government off your back. Now, never mind that he was a drug warrior extraordinaire, right? But imagine if getting the government off your back, that traditional conservative Republican message, could be combined with a younger, hipper, more popular among the youth message of, allowing people in the individual states to make decisions on this kind of stuff for themselves. If the conservative people in Oklahoma don't want marijuana, they don't have to have it. If Lamar Smith in Texas wants to keep it a felony in Texas, that's fine too. But we Republicans feel like the voters in, I was going to say Oregon, but we didn't elect that. We didn't pass that thing, Ben, but they did in Washington and Colorado. If we conservatives, if the people in Washington and Colorado feel like this is what they want to do, we support the states' rights to develop in their own way. Now, is this going to happen? Well, absolutely not. But when was the last time either party really took my advice about anything? Are they even listening, Ben? Have you been sending out, every show that we do right to the White House? Oh, they're taping it themselves. You don't have to. They told you that they were paying attention. I have a feeling somewhere we're archived in some giant facility that just saves controversial podcasts. They've got us. They're monitoring. Matter of fact, maybe half our audience is federal agents writing down everything we say in Esperanto. Nonetheless, folks, the key to this whole thing, as I said, is the confrontation question. I am rooting for the government to explain its thinking. I'm not rooting for an answer, by the way. I'm not saying they have to come down pro or con on any of these things, whether it's drones, war on terror policy, drugs, any of them. My standards are so low, I just want you to explain yourself. We're becoming more imperious as a government, where we simply say, here's the ruling. We're not explaining the ruling. Here it is. I mean, you watch how the government goes to the Supreme Court, folks. In the old days, most of the time when the federal government had to deal with the Supreme Court, they would go in there and have their lawyers and the members of the judiciary say to the court, here's why we feel what we feel, A, B, C, D, E. More often than not these days, the government goes in and tries to claim that the plaintiffs or whatever that the court's ruling on don't have standing. In other words, we're not going to argue the merits of what they bring up. We're going to argue that they don't have a right to bring it up at all. Many of the recent court cases where many of us are dying to hear what the government's position is on these subjects get frustrated because they go in and don't give it to you. You think we're finally going to get a showdown here. We're going to find out what the government thinks about this. And they go in and say, it's our contention that the plaintiffs don't have standing. Well, what do you feel about the issue? We feel that the plaintiffs don't have standing. We'd like you to dismiss the case because we feel like they don't have a legal right to bring it. So, as I've said to you before, my standards have fallen very low. I want legislators who are honest. I don't care as much about their positions as I care about, I want you to be honest and not corrupt. And I want the government to explain their thinking and come out and defend it. I don't care so much about what it is. Explain to me why you believe what you believe and then try to defend it. Can you imagine the government getting up there and trying to explain to you today why marijuana should stay a Schedule I drug, why it's as bad as heroin, cocaine, and LSD? They're not going to do that because they know it's ridiculous. They're simply going to say it's a Schedule I drug. Congress made it a Schedule I drug because it's a Schedule I drug, blah, blah, blah. I think on a whole range of issues, they know that their position, if they came out and debated it openly, is relatively indefensible. So they've decided not to try to debate it openly. And as I said, this is not a President Obama thing, although I feel like it gets worse with every administration. This is a trend that's been getting worse for a long time. Schlesinger wrote that famous book, The Imperial Presidency, in the early 1980s. It's gotten quite a bit worse since then. But an imperial presidency, an imperial government doesn't have to explain what they do. It becomes like one of those parents that says, here's the ruling. I'm not going to explain to you why. I don't have to explain why. I'm your dad. I don't have to tell you why I don't want you riding motorcycles. I'm your dad. I say you don't ride motorcycles, so you don't ride motorcycles. That's what this is like to me. And anything that forces the government into a position where they have to explain something rather than just tell you how they rule on it, if it's not positive, Ben, to me it's the best version of any reality show I'm ever going to watch. Forget the Jersey Shore. Forget this new one about hill people in West Virginia. The reality show I want to see is the government explains its policies. Boom, I'll get the popcorn, sit down, watch TV, and I will tape all the episodes if I'm going to be out of town, because in my book, that's must-see TV.